I have been thinking about death ever since that event happened at the border in Berlin, right? And
Ah,
then this is the second time where it's like where you start to think about, well, although it happened 6 years later, but I don't know where I would have been, and so you think about it a lot. And I'm going to get to later on when we talk about the experience that I had in Brazil, because it all comes full circle. And and my fear of death ultimately went away. But um, it's needless to say, it's a very humbling experience,
mm,
right? And it makes you question so much, but it also makes you really be so grateful for what you have,
mm,
and make you stop and realize that gratitude is such an important part of the equation, and don't lose sight of it.
yeah.
And I think that's from a positive perspective, I think that's what it really helped me to appreciate.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of My Life in Four Trades. With me today is Saad Shah, managing partner and co-founder at Noetic Fund. Hi, Saad. It's great to see you. Welcome to My Life
Hi,
in
Meg.
Four Trades.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure. Good to see you again.
I'm excited to have this conversation. So, before we jump into the trades, it's our tradition to just learn a little bit about your background. So, where'd you grow up and what were you like as a kid?
Well, my background is pretty much of a nomadic background, really. I'm the son of a diplomat, a career diplomat. My father served about close to 35 years for the Pakistani government. So we moved around as diplomats every 3 or 4 years. Just pack up your bags and go to a different city, country, culture, and that was very interesting. It was a core part of my upbringing because I had to learn how to adapt really fast if I didn't want to get beaten up in the schoolyard. So we grew up in countries and cities like Abu Dhabi. I was in Ottawa. Parents were posted to Burma in Yangon. But my formative years were spent in Berlin, in East Berlin, in fact. And this is in the mid 80s. So this is, right at the cusp of just before perestroika really took off. And those were very, very important years for me, because my siblings and I would study in West Berlin. So every day we'd cross the border to go to school. And it was like going through 50-year time warp every time we crossed the border. And it would take me sometimes an hour and a half to get to school because I had to get on the streetcar in East Berlin. And the streetcars at that time were still very much, hadn't changed at all since World War II, at all. So it would kind of meander its way through these bullet-riddled buildings and finally get to the border. And then you'd have to cross the border, and there was protocol to follow there. And on one of those instances, Maggie, I almost got shot because I ran across the border, and you're never supposed to run. And I
Oh,
ran. I could see my bus, and I was late, and I wanted to make it. And they cocked the guns, and they put on the siren, and I stopped and I was sent back home, and I put my head down and was just sort of thinking and wondering what was that all about, and what is life all about, and why are we here?
yeah.
I ask all those questions. So
That's a lot for a kid or teenager to try
yeah,
to comprehend. How did you even make sense of all of that?
well, it was one of those. It was a catalyst for me because it kind of got me to really pay attention to my surroundings. Berlin's a very interesting city, right? It's really, East and West Berlin essentially are cut up into four different divisions. You had the British, French, you had the American, and then you had East Berlin, which was really Putin's territory for the most part. Remember, Putin played a very important role in Berlin. He was the head of the KGB. He was based in Dresden, and my dad's told me that I've met him several times. I don't remember, but
Mm,
he needed to come and sort of share a lot of information with the Pakistani government about what was happening in Afghanistan. At that time, there was still a lot of Russian interest in Afghanistan, so they were always exchanging information. So I saw this guy going, and I don't know who he was, but later on I found out that hey, that was Putin. It was like wow. So when you grow up in that kind of environment, you know that the house is bugged. You know that there's that when you pick up the phone, you hear the Stasi officers often speaking, or oftentimes it was the Russian officers speaking, and then they would go, "Shh, quiet, they're on the phone." Like I can hear you guys. I just pick up the phone. It's like, but and then you'd have a conversation. It was bugged. You could hear static in the walls, so you knew that, and so you had to be very conscious of everything you did and said. And so, at a young age, when you're asked to be very aware of your environment, both in terms of politically, socially, environmentally, you're wired differently. Right.
Yeah.
And so that did have a huge impact on me and upbringing, but it was also an incredibly enriching experience. It was
Yeah.
incredibly enriching experience. You couldn't do very much in East Berlin, so I spent a lot of my time as a nerd in the at the Boda Museum, which is the really big museum in East Berlin, because they had the gates of Babylon, the gates of Ishtar, like they were just dropped down there. And it was an incredible museum, still is. But that's where I'd hang out and looking at antiquities, and just it tells you what a sad state of affair it was. But it was very.
Well,
It was very enriching.
I won't ask you about your social life at that time. But were you aware of money at a young age? Because you ultimately make your way into finance. Were you interested in that? Was it math? How do you connect to that?
No, well, yes, because you know the exchange rate between East and West
Mm.
German mark was 11, 12, 15 to 1 at one point, right? But the buying power was pretty similar, right? So you had a tremendous amount of trades going on. Folks that would come into East Berlin, they'd buy everything from caviar, art, musical instruments, Bratislava crystal, Meissen porcelain, and then go across the border and sell it for just egregious amounts. So what I became aware of, and essentially I kind of took my career initially into foreign exchange and commodity trading, which makes sense, is that I was very, very, very familiar with just the nature of FX and foreign exchange, and also a lot of the commodity trades that were going on at the time.
Mm.
So, but it wasn't a core focus for me. I think what was particularly interesting for me is just to kind of learn more about, some of the esoteric thinkers in Germany, right? I mean, I wouldn't call Carl Jung an esoteric thinker necessarily, and he was Swiss, of course, but folks like just the extent to which Nietzsche's philosophy, Schopenhauer's philosophy had an impact. Humboldt's philosophy had an impact, and so I got into philosophy, and more so the esoteric side of some of these philosophical ideas at an early age. That's what you do as a 16, 17-year-old when you're in East Berlin, I guess. I don't know.
Did your family think that you were going to follow in the footsteps and also be a diplomat?
That's what I wanted to do, Maggie. Absolutely. I wanted to be a diplomat, much like my father, much like other members of my family that had been serving, had served in the UN, and that's the path I wanted to go down. That was the path for me. If not that, then the idea was for me to look to join the family business, which was back in Pakistan, which is predominantly in steel manufacturing. That's the family business. So when you're born, you're given a name, you're told this is your religion, you're told this is your community, this is your neighborhood, this is your family, and then you spend the rest of your life protecting it.
Mhm.
You're born right away with wearing many different masks. And I think one of the things that started to happen to me early on in my teens was I started to realize that I'm wearing these masks and start to question, is that really me? Is that who I am? And
Mm.
then spending, the rest of the years starting to take off the many masks. And
Yeah,
so I
and
know
find
that
your
this is
real
what I'm
self.
told. It's exactly it. And I think the
Yeah.
greatest sin that you can ever commit as a human being is to not live up to your own fullest potential and be you, because the other, close to 8 billion people on this planet are already taken. So who are you, right? What's your voice? And I think that sort of, a school of thought, that way of thinking came quite early in my life for me.
I love that sentiment.
Hey everyone, Rouse Venture Crypto, it's really my flagship show. It's where I interview the best guests in the world, people you never get on another show. I think it's the best show in macro, crypto, and Web3 combined. In fact, that's what it does. It covers everything. But really, it's all about the revolution in Web3 and crypto. And I'd love it if you got it every week in your inbox. All you have to do is just click on the link below, pop in your email address, and you'll get notified every time it comes out. And you don't miss anything as you take my journey into the exciting new world of crypto and Web3. Thanks.
So your first trade is one of your best trades, and it sounds like it's part of that journey of finding your true self. And that was walking away from a potential job at Lehman to move to Toronto. So sort of set the scene for us. This was, I think, in the mid 90s. What's going on in your life? Are you already working in finance? Are you trying to break into the business? What's happening with Saad around that time?
Yeah, just to kind of end the Berlin bit, in 1990, the wall came down. I was on the wall on 9th of November 1989, and then 1990 was the big event, and it was kind of came to a beautiful denouement by way of Pink Floyd performing The Wall on stage, where the stage was literally half of the stage was in East Berlin and the other was in West Berlin. It was a phenomenal concert, and that took place in July. And I remember the tickets to go to that concert were 50 Deutschmark, which is pretty expensive, but ultimately they just couldn't keep the people out. So everybody ended up, they had to break down the fences and everybody showed up. And that was just a beautiful concert. And I left there to come to the US. I went to Columbia. I graduated from Columbia with a degree in economics and political science, because I thought I'd go and join the diplomatic service. And I had a very good friend of my father's that was at the UN, and I showed up at his door and I said, "Hey, I'm about to graduate. I'm ready to go. I want to join the UN. Can you point me in the right direction?" And he said, "Well, you're kind of out of luck." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because every country has a quota." And at that time, I was still a Pakistani citizen. And I said, every country has a quota, and the quota for your country is full up, and it's going to be full up for the next 2 years. I'm like, "Well, what do I do?" And he said, "Well, I don't know, maybe banking." And like, okay. Okay, so I said, fine. I was kind of upset. I said, maybe I'll show up in another year's time and they'll put me somewhere, even if it's handing out blankets somewhere in the world. I joined the UN, but it was a no-go, and I had to pivot and start to think about banking and investment banking or finance. And I had a semester, 2 semesters left at Columbia, and I got into the Columbia Business School finance class. I convinced the professor to let me in. She let me in, Professor Ashley, and that was great. That was an eye-opening thing for me, because all of a sudden I realized, wow, this is something I enjoy. So I pivoted to looking at finance, and after I graduated, I was at that time applying to all these different places. Lehman picked up the resume, called me in. I went for a couple of interviews, and at that time, I had a girlfriend that had just graduated from MIT. She's Canadian and Canadian citizen, and now she's my wife of 27 years. So she said, "Look, I'm going to go to Toronto. I'm going to go to Canada." And I said, "Toronto." And she goes, "You should come." And I said, "All right." And I received a letter that said, "Please come in for a final interview." And
the timing is this is lining up as very difficult timing. First of all, how did you have a girlfriend at MIT if you were at Columbia? Where'd you meet?
We met in Boston, because I had a lot of friends in Boston, and Boston was the party town. Ask anybody. Like, just
I went to school
so
in Boston.
many universities. So it was just
I know of what you speak, Saad. It's a
lot of friends, lot of friends in Boston, and so it's they wouldn't come to New York as much as I'd go to Boston, and I met her. We had mutual friends, and I met her when I was literally 18.
Okay. So you've been going out for a little while at this point.
Well, we started. Yeah, we were friends for a couple of years, and then we started to go out. And then when she graduated, I said, "Well, what do you want to do? We could live in New York. We could live in LA. We can live wherever." And she goes, "Toronto." I'm like, "Okay, all right." And particularly, it wasn't really in Toronto either. It was like 2 hours away from Toronto, in a city called London, Ontario. She had landed a great job with 3M, and the Canadian headquarters for 3M are in London, Ontario. So I said, "You know what? It's I may be in a better in a competitive environment there, because maybe they don't have as many Columbia grads or whatnot. I thought this would be easy, perhaps." Was I wrong? So I gave up that opportunity to go to Lehman Brothers, but the Lehman Brothers job was to take place in World Trade Center, building number one, the North Tower. And there literally, I don't think, is a week that goes by now where I don't think about what could have potentially happened, right? Because I think of myself and I go, okay, God forbid, this is a situation that's happened. What would you have done? Would you have made it, made a beeline to the exits or to the elevator? What would you have done? It's particularly painful for me because I lost a very dear friend who was not working in the World Trade Center, who happened to go there that day for breakfast up in the
Windows on the World. Yeah,
that's right. And
there's a big conference there that day.
And he perished. He perished in that. And he was a classmate of mine at Columbia, Raja Tashamul Haq. So yeah.
So it doesn't even feel theoretical to you. It literally feels like that could have been you.
Yes, it could have, because I feel that I wouldn't have been one of those guys that have made it. I would have probably, I just know myself. I would have well, where's Joe and where's Peter? And I got to go see if they're in the bathroom, and let's get everybody together and let's get everybody out. And
Yeah. It's a real sliding door moment, isn't it? When you know that you made a decision in that moment that has this profound outcome that you're reminded of all the time. I mean, does that? How do you think? I mean, because we mark that anniversary every year. You must be constantly reminded of that.
I have been thinking about death ever since that event happened at the border in Berlin, right? And then this is the second time where it's like where you start to think about, well, although it happened 6 years later, but I don't know where I would have been, and so you think about it a lot. And I'm going to get to later on when we talk about the experience that I had in Brazil, because it all comes full circle. And my fear of death ultimately went away. But it's needless to say, it's a very humbling experience, right? And it makes you question so much, but it also makes you really be so grateful for what you have, and make you stop and realize that gratitude is such an important part of the equation, and don't lose sight of it. Yeah. And I think that's from a positive perspective, I think that's what it really helped me to appreciate.
So we can understand from a life perspective why this was the best trade. Not only are you with your then girlfriend, now wife, but you managed to avoid that outcome. What work-wise, how was the transition?
It was, I was of the opinion I'd show up and they'd be like, Saad, we've been waiting for you. Where have you been? And, thank you. And here's the national anthem, and here's your citizenship. And, we've got you a job running a bank or something. And now. So I got there and it was like, listen, pal, you don't have a work permit. I'm like, no. So you got to apply for one. I said, okay, well, how long does that take? Well, you apply for one, it may take about a year and a half. Like, a year and a half. And they're like, yeah. And now what I had done was, because I had given up my ability to go back to the States because I was under, a foreign student visa, I had to stay in Canada. And I was like, that's fine. And they said, well, one way to get around it is to get one of the banks or any company to sponsor you, but the bar is pretty high to get sponsored, right? And I didn't get sponsored. I had to wait it out for a year and a half. But the only jobs I could get are jobs that would pay me sort of, in cash. So I was a bartender. I was a waiter. But probably the most interesting job that I had for about 9 months was as a door-to-door salesman. It was one of the only jobs that could pay you, and I refused to not pay for rent and for my wife and I to be together. And so I joined as a door-to-door salesman. I went to remote areas of Ontario, knocking on doors, selling 2-for-1 certificates to golf courses, to restaurants. But I didn't see it as the door-to-door way. I was like, okay, here I am in this part of the world, and I'm learning so much about the Canadian economy, the Canadian people. I'm learning about who are what the grievances are, but also I am fine-tuning a skill that I needed fine-tuning, quite frankly, which was you're showing up at somebody's door. They don't know you at all. You look like this, and then you ring the doorbell. They open. They go, "What do you want?" And they're like, "Are you here to sell something?" And then you have to try and convince them within the next 2 or 3 minutes why they should part with $20. Everything we sold was $20, and that was something that I started to focus in on, which is how do you find a way to build that relationship with somebody in a very short period of time, and how do you convey a narrative and a story? How do you, really get to know them and understand, the shoes that they're in? And that was profound. I think that was profound. I think that's something that there's absolutely no MBA course or class that can ever teach you that.
No, absolutely. It's the elevator pitch, but much more personal, because you're not only having to sell something quickly, but you have to make that connection. Interesting that you recognized the connection part of it, because that's these days we talk about that, but back then, sales is just sort of banging the phone. You see Wolf of Wall Street, it's like barking at people, but you sort of understood the connection. That's very interesting.
Not only the connection, but you also, it's important too that you had to understand them and then qualify them to say, like, do you go out to restaurants? Yes, I do. Where do you typically go here? Blah, blah, blah. And so, sales has a process to it. There's a method to the madness there. And that's what I learned. But more importantly, I really learned about what was happening in the economy and what folks were happy about or upset about. I had to break my comfort zone. I really had to shatter my comfort zone. That was not very comfortable for me, but it ultimately became a cornerstone for me.
So you end up at RBC, you eventually do get a job in finance.
Yes.
Do you think that helped you, that experience, that opened the door for you?
Yeah, ultimately I got into real estate banking at the Royal Bank of Canada, and that was great because now I was able to kind of be in the area that I wanted to be in for the moment. Real estate was not intellectually stimulating enough for me. I wanted to get more onto the market side of the equation, capital markets, and I was always very fascinated by the trading floor.
Mm.
And so, and I personally think that was just another mask that I had to take off ultimately. But I managed to get onto the trading floor in debt syndication, and then spent some time there, and then moved on to the foreign exchange and commodity desk, and ultimately became the head of a financial engineering deal team for RBC. And it kind of did well at an early enough age there, where ultimately I realized, wait a second, it's very myopic in the sense that it is very much focused on just a few distinct commodities that are important to Canada, that are important to RBC. And the currencies also, it's not a big range of currencies. They're not really big in emerging market currencies. They're really focused on everything CAD related. And they were the biggest players in CAD and cross CAD currencies. So, but at the same time, it was an unbelievable experience. The core part of that job was to try and explain complexity. That how do you build a narrative where you're trying to explain complex trades to institutions and to those that are looking at very complex mergers and acquisitions, and helping them understand how their exposures are going to be hedged. Right. At the same time, we were also talking to some other desks that were very sophisticated that wanted to take a position really in the market. And they were looking at digital options or one-touch structures, which were quite risky at the time. But those were happening at that time. That was exciting time. I mean, prop desks have changed, of course, over the years, right? But at that time, it was like at the tail end of it, but it was still active and exciting. And I had a limit that I could trade on a daily basis, and it was fun and exciting. But ultimately, I kind of became a little tired of it and bored of it. And I had heard about some friends of mine that were looking to start a fund of funds business as well as a direct hedge fund. And that all of a sudden became very interesting.
Yeah. So that brings us to your second trade. And this is also one of your best. And that's the decision to leave RBC and to build Diversified Global Asset Management in 2006. So I think that you sort of set up for us that it was the need for more intellectual stimulation or a more challenging environment that led to it. Were you scared though to leave the security of RBC? I mean, you were doing very well there.
I was doing very well. I was even told that, listen, don't mess things up. You're on a fast track here for a whole host of reasons, and that things are going well for you. And I just felt that, look, um, uh, if I don't explore and push the limits in terms of who I am, then I'll be doing myself a disservice. And going back to kind of like the old Kierkegaard quote that essentially says that if you're not living up to your fullest potential, then you're really committing a sin. And so I was again the focus at RBC at that time was quite narrow in terms of what they were doing, and all of a sudden you're looking at a team that's very interested in looking at these esoteric hedge fund strategies that didn't really exist. So what DGAM at that time was looking to do was they were seeding strategies that didn't exist before. It wasn't about seeding managers. It was about seeding strategies. So they were one of the first ones to do reinsurance. They were trading precipitation and temperature around the world. They were one of the first ones to do commercial litigation finance. Music royalty. We had a very large library of music assets that every time it played on a radio station or elsewhere, we got a royalty from it, right? We were, in a big way, we did film financing, and that we did with Dune Entertainment. Steve Mnuchin at the time was running that. And we, were one of their biggest backers and backed them across 77 films that they did with 20th Century Fox.
Wow.
Starting off.
That's a really diverse. Do you have to understand all of those? Were you kind of throwing yourself in and learning about all of those different markets? Was that necessary?
You had to, but what you had to really do was make sure that they knew what they were doing, right? There.
Yeah.
So of course you had to kind of dive in and truly understand what was the risk premium and why this was so engaging. But the approach that we took at DGAM was this. Look, we said to the institutions, you guys can manage the traditional hedge fund strategies yourself, small, kind of long, short and macro and trend following. Let us manage complexity for you, right? And I bring up that word complexity again, because my job was to explain the complexity to these, to say, here's where we feel and why we feel there's alpha here. And the alpha is fleeting, but it's all about sizing and timing of the strategy and tilting of the strategy. And this is why we feel it'll do well when markets are really stressed. And to be frank, across all our strategies, there were a lot of complex credit trades, complex commodity trades. Pharmaceutical royalty was a really big one that we did. But the strategies did okay when markets were doing well. But all of a sudden, when you hit 2007, 2008, 2009, 2011, we were outperforming. We were one of the first ones to do tail hedging, right? But very complex version of tail hedging, right? We were trying to find the cheapest form of volatility that would really hedge our tails, our left tails, during some very stressed market environments, and we did well in those environments, right? So we had the ability now, all of a sudden, where everybody else was down anywhere from 25 to 40%, we were flat to a little bit high, but we had capital available to deploy in those markets. And so the trajectory for DGAM was really during those years, and that ultimately caught the attention of the Carlyle Group.
Right. And so they buy DGAM. Was that a hard decision for you all to go under the umbrella? Because you kind of sound like you're out there pushing the envelope, doing things no one else is doing. There's a sort of excitement to that. And Carlyle's well-known traditional, they're kind of big. Did it feel like you were selling out? I mean, you were selling, but did it feel like you were selling out, or how did you all view that?
Yeah, we were closing in on about 10 years by then, right? And what we really needed to kind of take it to the next level, we were already close to about 7 billion in assets. And what we really needed was that form of permanent capital behind us that would allow us to now get to the 20, 30 billion. And we felt that Carlyle was the perfect shop for it because they had already entered into the hedge fund foray, right? They had taken over a lot of assets from Peters Hill Fund, which was at Goldman. And so they had Claren Road, they had Vermilion, they had Trafalgar. So we felt, okay, they understand hedge funds. We think they understand hedge funds. So let's now, talk to them about it. And look, David is incredibly charismatic, charming. I have a tremendous amount of respect for him. I've learned a lot from him. and spent a decent amount of time with him for a short period of time, but it was concentrated time. And they were going down a path that at the time, made sense. I think ultimately it wasn't the best trade for either of us. Ultimately, I think it was just that really, you had to speak a different nomenclature when it came to hedge funds. It was no longer about, multiples or MOIC or DVPI. TVPI was now all about alpha, beta, right? Sortino ratio, Sharpe ratios. And you had a sales team that has been entrenched at Carlyle for a very long time that, needed to be brought up the curve in terms of how to speak that language. And hedge funds have a role in a portfolio that are very meaningful. I mean, we showed that in years like 2008, 2009, 2011. But I think that mismatch, we didn't pay a lot of attention to, didn't realize. And ultimately, when Carlyle kind of shut down all their hedge fund operations, we were a casualty of that too. So we were, but I had left about 6 months before that had happened. I decided to leave because I saw kind of the writing on the wall. And I wanted to venture into launching a quant equity fund. I thought that's the thing to do. There was a model that was at work. It was an AI-driven model. I was excited about it. I went to David. And I said, "Listen, David, this is what I'd like to do." And he said, "Look, I'm not going to stand in your way, but if it doesn't work out, come back." And I said, "I will. I will."
Oh, that's that's a very stand-up thing to do.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So David was a guest on My Life in Four Trades, and it was amazing. Yeah, it was amazing to spend that time with him. And that anecdote fits what, I'm not surprised to hear that he handled it that way. He's also a sort of diplomat at heart. I think share that passion, right?
Yep, that's exactly right.
So it's interesting. So that was your best trade. But then, thinking about it, there are also parts of it. A lot of the best trades have worse trade elements and vice versa, which we're going to get to when we get to number 4 as well, I think. But your third trade, you just mentioned, so you leave Carlyle on your own volition, and you launch this AI-driven quant equity fund. And this is 2016. It strikes me that all we talk about is AI now. But that was, those were early days. Is this what we would think of as like an algo quant fund? Is that how we kind of talked about it back then?
No. It's really interesting because it was the model was using natural language processing.
Oh.
To be able to decipher, thousands and thousands and thousands of pieces of text, and then infer from that how that would impact the market.
Right.
And then we take that information and we would look to, like into call options when certain, things were triggered. And these would be longer dated call options that had a lot of convexity in it. And so we would look to trade on that. At the same time, we had a model that would leg into put options and, precipitate a ladder approach to put options. And then the third strategy was that we would actually write put options as well. So combining the writing of the put options and, going long put options, and then also going long the call options combined made a lot of sense on paper. And the model sort of, was started to work really well early on. And, we launched with our own capital early in 2016. And by February, we were up 38%. We were high-fiving each other.
That's some success.
Wow, I know. And so we were going, great, this is amazing. And so we wanted to spend a whole year trading our own capital and then show really good results for it. And then go out and raise, your 20, 30, 40, 50 million for the fund. And it was a team of 7 of us. And February rolls around, Brexit happens. The AI could not compute Brexit. And then it comes back and says, we were down a fair amount. Then we started to get back up again, and then Trump happens, and then AI says, "I could not compute that." And so we ended the year being down 1%. Our capital was gone in that. Of course, it was not easy, but we decided that there's no way we're going to be able to go out. If we were able to show that in those stressed environments with Brexit and Trump happening in the same year, we did well, then we've got a case. That lot of lessons, of course, tremendous amount of lessons. I can write a couple of volumes on that, by the way. But it was something that I felt that I had to go through, and it didn't work out the way we were expecting.
Yeah, so it is one of your worst trades. It's interesting though that there's a pattern because it seems like you are constantly challenging yourself or following the thing that's most intellectually interesting to you. A bit of a risk taker in that respect. Like you leave security for the unknown. Again, this time it didn't work out, but there's a trend.
There is, and what I learned later on is that I'm something that's known as a manifesting generator, according to some human design studies. And what that means is that I need to rely on certain centers to give me validation whether this is something I want to do. But oftentimes I have to be engrossed and involved in it. Only then will I realize, is this something I want to do or not? Right. So other people will say, do you want to go into banking? And they'll know whether they want to go into banking or not. For me at the time when I went in, I was like, I think I want to go, but I'm not sure. I got to try it out to really know. And then you go in and you do it, and then you go, this is not for me. But no, I'm not averse to taking risks. I just feel that if you don't take risks and you don't break your comfort zone, you're never going to really progress. And it's a core part of my personality and my traits. And I've taken a lot of risks, Maggie, and a lot of them have not worked out for me at all. But yes, you're right. It is a bit of a trait in me to kind of like, let's do this, and we're going to find out if it's going to work or not, because otherwise we can sit here and it'll be analysis paralysis, right? We can, think of all the ways in which it can't happen. Yeah. And sometimes you just have to do the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 rule, which is, you think of something and you go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, just do it. Don't think about it, just do it. And then we'll see where it leads. Just jump.
What do you think you learned from that experience in terms of funds and launching funds and your career, really? What did that failure teach you?
It was very humbling, right? You thought that you had built all these relationships up with institutional investors that would support you in endeavors like this, and you really got to know that first and foremost, when it comes to speaking with institutional investors as opposed to family offices and high net worth individuals, they're very different kettle of fish, right? And institutions are very much about check the box exercise. You got to meet certain criteria and parameters. And that all sort of came to culmination. And, I realized that you had to approach each of these parties in a very different way. Institutions were not going to be interested in this quant equity thing because it's just too small of a fund for them. So I was focusing more on family offices and ultra high net worths, and just understanding their utility function, their objectives. So that was a big learning. Going into business with closest friends, where they're friends first and then become business colleagues later, bad idea. Okay, not good. I would not recommend it. It doesn't really typically work out really well, and so that was another big major lesson. But just how to set up business, what to bring first into the equation, where to spend the money, how to hire the right talent. I mean, lots of lessons that way that I could have done better for sure.
Which I'm assuming are paying dividends now, because your fourth trade is your current trade. And it sounds like in some ways it grew out of the failure of the Quant Fund, because if that had taken off, you may have continued doing that, but it didn't. So you end up launching Noetic. So this one, I think we're also filing under, as I mentioned, best and worst. Worst in terms of the challenging environment, but best in terms of some of the other ways you feel about it. So let's unpack all of this. What is Noetic first? So what fund do you set up now? Are you still going in this sort of esoteric, complicated financial trades, or is it something else?
Yeah, I think a core part of, I'm realizing even as I'm speaking to you, there's certain themes that resonate throughout my life. Esotericism does. So, and what is esoteric? It's just something that's left of center, right? It's not mainstream. It's left of center. It's in the fringe. where you don't pay much attention to it. And then once you do start to pay much attention to it and everybody else starts to pay attention to it, all of a sudden it becomes mainstream, but it starts off on the fringe. And the other one is complexity, right? And I often try and explain to people there's a difference between complicated and complex. Complicated is getting, an astronaut to the moon. But if you follow a certain recipe and you follow it to the T, you get them to the moon. Complexity is raising a teenager. Right? Because there's so many independent variables that are at play that are independent of each other, and you just don't know what the hell is going to affect what, and you just kind of look at you look at them in a way where you think it's normal, but they look at you going, "What the hell are you looking at me that for?" I'm like, I didn't think I did anything wrong, and so
I'm living this right now, Saad. Like you are speaking to my soul right now.
So that's complexity, and but to explain complexity, is something where. That's very challenging, and that's something that I've always really reveled in and really enjoyed. How do you find a way to break it down into its core components and explain it in a way that they really truly understand it and appreciate it? And they're not walking away scratching their heads because you just threw a whole bunch of acronyms at them and you made them feel dumb because you sounded so smart about it, but they didn't get what you were saying, right? That defeats the purpose. So I think that's one of the core themes there. Noetic is really a culmination of my entire life. As they say, at any given point in time, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. And I just feel that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. But everything that's ever happened in my entire life has led me to this moment. Keep in mind that ever since that event happened in Berlin, where I crossed the border and I was questioning everything and being very aware of my surroundings, I started to go down this path of really studying esoteric philosophies in general, quantum physics, and I came across the works of so many different people that were writing about the role that distinct plants have played in certain societies across time and culture. And what was
you were searching for understanding the events that had happened to you, it sounds like.
Understanding events that happened to me, but understanding more, questioning the perennial questions. Why are we here? What's the purpose of life? What's the meaning of life?
Because you had a near-death experience.
I had a near-death experience, and I wanted to understand, again, and that was rekindled after 9/11 happened, right? And you questioned absolutely everything, right? 9/11 was so pivotal in so many different ways because all of a sudden, that entire house of cards that was set up came crashing down. You never thought something like that would have happened on U.S. soil. Right?
And I think from an individual perspective, exactly what you described in your life, that everyday decisions people made determined their fate that day. If they were late to the office, if they didn't get on a plane in Boston because they overslept, if they went to that breakfast concert, and that so many people struggle with that. I mean, I was in New York at the time, and in the area, so many people, survivors, struggled with that as much as the people who perished. It's that sort of what seemed to them to be a random moment, much like your experience, trying to mentally come to terms with that has been so difficult still for so many people.
No, you've hit the nail on the head. It's the ripple effects, right?
Yeah.
People don't realize that the impact the wave of grief and guilt that suicide survivors have to face, right? Once they lose somebody that's close to them that died of that committed suicide, it's it's unbearable. It's profound. It leads them to suicide oftentimes.
Yeah.
Right. And they were just, they had nothing to do with it, but they feel somehow responsible for it, or the ripple effects are just too profound. And,
so you on this journey where you're searching, and this is how the plant, and we'll I know a little bit about this part of Saad's life, so this will all make sense in a moment, but it's amazing that you sort of picked up on that, because it was only a little part of the journey you were on, but somehow you recognize this is important.
Yeah, again, like so many things are just, you feel that it's just meant to be. I was trying to understand consciousness and the role of consciousness, and I was looking for the answers in philosophy and religion. I was looking for it in quantum physics, right? And ultimately, there were a lot of sort of this reading that pointed me towards how certain communities explored consciousness through certain plants. right? But this is prevalent throughout. It's the blue lotus flower shows up a lot in Egyptian hieroglyphics and etchings. The Syrian root was very prominent in Mesopotamia, a very strong psychoactive component to it. The first ever rendition of anything written in Western literature is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was written on Sumerian tablets. Talked about a plant that grows at the bottom of the river that gives you immortality. The Soma was the first mention of this sort of a plant that was written, in the Rig Vedas at least 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, and that's all of the subcontinent, which is India, Sri Lanka, that whole area. And we still don't really know what the Soma is. Some people say it's a mushroom, some people say it's a plant, but again, it gave you immortality. So you look across Siberia, it was the Amanita muscaria. That's the red mushrooms with the white spots on it, right? Very famous. You see that in every Disney cartoon almost. And again, that is a very strong psychoactive component to it. So what was going on? Why were these being ingested? Who was ingesting them? What was the reasons behind it? And a lot of the texts suggest that it was for purposes of expanding consciousness, but it was also reserved by nobility. It was reserved by royalty. They didn't share it with the common people or the hoi polloi. They kept it for certain sort of folks. And when and of course in the Amazon there's ayahuasca, salvia divinorum. I mean there's so much going on in West Africa. There is Iboga, and the Dogon tribe used to use it to commune with their ancestors. So there's different reasons and rationales for it, but they have a lot of similar traits. And this was shown by way of cave art that they found in Australia, South Africa, and Europe. Like Australia, South Africa,
all
Europe,
over the place.
Right? But they're all 25 to 50,000 years old. But when you compare the cave art, they're so incredibly similar. They show chimeras and therianthropes, and they show these geometric patterns and hand patterns, and they show eyes. And you're like, did the same person from Australia go to South Africa and then did this and they had an exhibition perhaps in Europe? No, right? It's so why is that? And that was intriguing to me. And there's a beautiful book written, it's called The Visionary by Graham Hancock, which was a real turning point for me because I ultimately befriended him and got to know him and had a discussion about this with him and said, why is this? Is it because it's something that's in our consciousness and we're all tapping into it? Or is it that we all see distinct things regardless of our cultural background, heritage, ethnicity, whatnot? We're seeing the same things, and it comes in certain waves and patterns. Now, I had never done any of this stuff, or I'd never dabbled in it, I'd never taken it, never ingested a mushroom, nothing.
Right. This is like, I'm imagining this is the banker fund manager that we can hear fell deep down the rabbit hole when you find this, because you can tell from your enthusiasm and all the research you've done that you've locked on this now and you're on to something.
I blame Australia, and I'll tell you why. I had to travel to Australia from Toronto, and I had to go to Melbourne, right? Because that's where VFMC and that's where Future Fund, all those guys are there. And that damn trek took me 27 hours. Okay, so it's like coming out of solitary confinement when you disembark and you find yourself. Like, I know who I am, but I had a lot of time to read on that. Like, you can only watch so many movies, and so I took a lot of those books with me, and I had a lot of time to read. And this is where I figured out, wow, this is something that needs to be looked into a lot more. And there were a lot of Harvard professors that had written about this. Carl Rook had written about it. Timothy Leary was sort of onto it. It was a fascinating time for me because I was learning a lot about this. And ultimately, I befriended Graham and I said, "Can I talk to you about it?" And we became friends. And then he said, "Look, have you ever tried this?" I'm like, "No." He's like, "Well, why don't you come down to Brazil with me?" I'm like, "Oh, well, who's going?" And he's like, "Well, we're going to go and study the ways of the Shipibo tribe. And there's going to be Professor Michael Winkelmann there, and there's going to be Professor Luis Eduardo Luna there, and you'll really enjoy it." And I convinced my wife that I should go to this, and I went down and I spent.
I think this is where the manifesting generator comes in, right? Exactly. Like, I've got to do it. See,
I got to do it. I felt that I had to. It was a very strong calling, but also to be around these luminaries, Luis Eduardo Luna and Michael Winkelmann and Graham there too, and really learn from them and truly understand the role that these medicines have played across time and culture was just profound. But also to now understand the ways of this tribe, the Shipibo tribe, was just I couldn't give up that opportunity. So that's what I did at the age of 38 or 39. It was in the year 2009. I went down to Brazil. I told the guys that I'm taking 2 weeks off. They're, where are you going? Can't tell you really. I only I mentioned this to Warren Wright, who's my current business partner and the co-founder at Noetic. But this is really the beginning of Noetic, I feel. And in 2009, I went down, spent 2 weeks there, and had 5 distinct ceremonies with a plant medicine called ayahuasca. Never having taken any psychedelic before in my life, for that matter, any other substance, and it was a profound experience. Would be a hell of an understatement.
An experience are hard to find words for.
People say, "Well, what did you see? What did you experience?" And I go, I can't explain it because I don't think my imagination has the vocabulary to be able to explain it to you. But what I can explain is the essence that you get from it. And it's almost like you've been looking out at the world from a dirty window. And somebody comes along and takes a squeegee and cleans that window for you. And now you're able to see the world in a very different way. That was my experience. I have to say that is not, it's not typical either. I mean, people will have very different experiences, and a lot of people have a very difficult experience with this. That's why these are incredibly powerful molecules, and they need to be respected. They need to be revered. They need to be approached with reverence, and there's a lot of preparation that goes into it. Tremendous amount of preparation for a month in advance. You can't eat red meat. You've got to cut out all salt. You can't eat. You cannot have any refined sugar. You've got to stick to vegetables. The raw, the better, right? And also, you have to sort of just get your frame of mind properly set for it. So, and then of course, during the experience itself, it's incredibly taxing. So people go, "Why do it? Right? Why go through that exercise? Because you're purging a great deal from all ends. You're purging. It's a long, drawn out purging exercise." And you're crying a lot, and it's one of those monumental experiences, but at the same time, it's not something that you want to rush back into.
Right. So it was transformational. Did you come away feeling healed, feeling a new sense of knowledge, a new sense of direction?
I came away without having any fear of death any longer. Because to me, it was made very clear to me, based on what I had experienced, that this cycle never ends, really. This game never ends. Energy transfers. It doesn't die. And so you're constantly evolving. You're not evolving as Saad or Maggie. You're evolving as the core essence of the fabric of the universe and existence itself. And so without getting too woo-woo on everybody on this session, it is a very, it's a very personalized experience, of course, but for me, the downloads were the death should not be feared. And
which is a huge thing to overcome for you, given what you had been through.
Precisely.
So you have this very, very profound experience of metamorphosis. I mean, we don't have any good words for it because it was so big in your life, but you then choose to make this your business as well. Why?
At that time, obviously there was no business idea behind this, but I just came back, and the first person that I really spoke to about this was Warren Wright. Warren was the chief investment officer at DGAM, and soon to be Carlyle Liquid Markets Group. And Warren was the only one. And Warren and I traveled a lot together, and we shared a common interest in all of this. So when I shared it with him, we both went down this rabbit hole of researching and studying it more. We got in touch with the professors that had been talking about this and working with this at Johns Hopkins, at Harvard, and Imperial College in London, at the University of California, San Diego, University of California, Los Angeles. I mean, there were Basel University in Switzerland. We were just going, wow, what is this? Why don't more people know about this? But what's the mechanism of action? What's actually happening? What are the molecules in there that are behaving in the manner that they are, and where are they going in the brain? What are they triggering? Why is it that you've got so many people? Now we've got about more than 100 years of anecdotal evidence that clearly suggests that there are profound benefits to this if it's done in the right way. That there's
Therapeutic benefits.
Profoundly, right? And so, what's actually going on? And so, from 2009, when I had this experience, for the next 5-8 years, that's what the research and the study was all about. When Cubed, which is the Quant Equity Fund, we closed that down in 2017. And I was advising a few players in the market, the larger private equity firms and some of the venture firms. We started to see in 2018 that a market was developing where there was an opportunity to put private funding towards research and actual commercialization of certain plant-based entheogens, as they call them, or psychedelics, right? There was Sage Therapeutics, there was Atai Life Sciences, that's Christian Angermeyer's company, and his work, Compass Pathways. We called up some of the folks that we knew in the industry through my hedge fund days that were running $60 billion credit shops that had invested in this to go, why are you investing in it? And they said, well, this is where we think the future is going, and this is why we think it's going to be profound. And it's low toxicity, it's highly efficacious, and it'll ultimately get through FDA and DEA, but there are risks, of course. So Warren and I decided to just put our own money to work and put it in, and then friends and family started to find out and said, well, can you take our money? And then I was like, well, I guess we have to set up a fund. And I always liked the word noetic because that's sort of what kind of describes my philosophy and approach, which is, everything to do with the intellect and your experiences as a human, the noetic qualities. And so we set up Noetic in February of 2020. We opened the fund up. We created a fund and opened it up for others to come in. And that was the beginning of the Noetic Fund. We ended up making 24 investments in the first fund. We raised 33 million for fund number one. We looked at 1,000 companies, and we're looking specifically at very science-backed. So what Noetic does is, Noetic is a fund that is focused on the central nervous system. We are not a psychedelic fund. We're a fund that is focused on central nervous system or mental health. And we're looking at very science-backed opportunities that have a strong IP. IP is important, intellectual property, because that allows it to be scalable and accessible and to be rolled out. We're looking at, very research-driven, science-backed, non-CPG, non-consumer packaged good approach to actually looking at curing these ailments as opposed to just treating the symptom. And there's just a tremendous amount of research out there that suggests that many of what's going on in psychedelic drug development is important, but there are other areas that are important to us too, like magnetic resonance technology, medical devices, digital therapeutics, vagus nerve stimulation. There's a lot going on in this space. It's a renaissance period for neuroscience.
Which is tremendous. It's interesting that, so we talked about this being the best and worst. Let's cover the worst part, because it's, as we've been hearing more and more about it. So you went down the rabbit hole well before it popped up on the radar, but there was this sort of wave. We've all seen the reports on television about, the benefits of this, curing addiction, working with people who have suicidal thoughts, of, people were really therapy resistant. So there's been a lot of buzz, but it's been a tough market, hasn't it? It's been a difficult market in terms of the sort of investment climate around this. Why is that, and what have you seen?
It's been a difficult market because there was a lot of hype initially.
Yeah.
That hype was on the back of what happened in cannabis. And you had a lot of cannabis investors that came onto the scene to say, hey, listen, the people that went in, that the investors that got into cannabis early in the game did really, really well. And so here psychedelics comes along. It's kind of like cannabis, which it isn't. Like, it's just apples and oranges, man. It's just, you cannot be so, but there was that sentiment. And these hype-driven investors didn't want to lose out, and they had FOMO. And so they got in. The public markets were quite receptive to this. A lot of these companies were looking to list on the public exchange. And, there's 80 publicly traded stocks between Canada, the US, and Europe that are in psychedelics. And so that hype really kind of drove up valuations, prices, and all of that ultimately came crashing down. Now, we were, of course, involved in a lot of those trades where, we only invested in private companies and some of them went public, but we exited most of those positions at a time that suited us because we didn't think that how the public markets were valuing these really biotech pharma plays made any sense. There was no revenue. They had a long path. We didn't know about regulators that are going to approve it. The DA was still on the sideline. And there was a lot of assumptions made. And all of a sudden, you're seeing these companies well over $1 billion. No, that doesn't make any sense. So we exited, did well for our portfolio, of course, but then we went into the slump. The last year and a half, it's now we're coming out of it for sure, but it was a very, very, very difficult period of time, especially in light of the macro headwinds that we've been facing. And you're in VC, and everybody's looking for liquidity to put money to work in a VC opportunity that has a long tail to it. You're going to go, no, that's not my first choice, kiddo. And it's like, okay, so it's been incredibly challenging that way, and then also to work with your portfolio companies that are constantly in need of raising more and more money in this environment, right? And they're money good. They're good companies that are doing well and they're showing results, but it's been so difficult to raise money for them that's been the real challenge. This has been the most difficult period of time in my career in capital markets, in asset management, to raise money for. So unless you're specifically doing credit, or if you've got an AI bent, it's not that easy.
Yeah, that's right. Everybody, all the money's rushing there, and it's scarce elsewhere. So yet you remain optimistic, and this is why it's your best trade.
Well, our fund one has done phenomenally well so far, right? And we've
so
had
all those lessons learned from some of the past.
Yes, that's right. That's right. We chose well. I think we got lucky. It was luck and timing. I kind of always try and revert back to the David Rubenstein humility of things, and so yes, I think I just was in the right place at the right time. But we had 6 exits, so that has done well for fund number one. We've got some other events taking place in the portfolio that are going to do really well for it. Now we're on fund number 2. But this is part and parcel of a zeitgeist movement that I have sort of identified. I feel that it's just, whether you look at cryptocurrency, whether you look at what's happening with psychedelic drug development, what's happening in the wellness space overall, what's happening with decentralization of currencies, what's happening with climate change as well. The one theme is everybody wants agency. They want to take agency. They want to take agency back. They want to say, this is, I want to have access to, a certain currency and want to do it this way. I want it to be decentralized. I want it to be specific to what I want and need and so on. It's about personalization, and medicine is going towards personalization, right? No two people are the same. You can't say, well, take this exact same dose for everybody. Everybody would be, no. I mean, our DNA, our makeup, our framework, epigenetics plays a huge part in it. Our environment, we're all wired differently, right? And it's different strokes for different folks. And we have to understand that we've got to, personalize medicine, and only then will it start to work. There is no deeper or more profound example of personalized medicine than when it comes to psychedelics. Because you could give 50,000 people, the exact same dosage of this medicine, and they will have 50,000 different experiences. No two people will have the same experience ever, right? So, we're riding this wave within our industry in itself, wellness. It is by far the fastest growing segment in the market. Number one. Number two, we have learned so much from oncology, from cancer research, and we're using that. We're putting that into and transferring that information knowledge. AI has done a profound amount has brought a lot to the table as well. Now we don't need to put 2 or 3 molecules together and put it in a petri dish and wait 3 days to watch it and see what reaction comes about. AI can tell us exactly the various permutations that will bring about different outcomes. And we've got 100 years of anecdotal evidence that's now finally out in terms of how it affects the certain receptors the way it does as an agonist or as an antagonist. So with all of that, The final part is we've learned more about the human brain in the last 5 years than any other point in history. And the pandemic had a huge role to play there. Loneliness is the biggest epidemic in the US. The US Surgeon General just went around the whole US, came back and said, we missed the boat. It's not COVID or anything else. It's loneliness. Loneliness leads to inflammatory related ailments, right? Then leads to trauma, big T, small t trauma, then leads to inflammatory related ailments. I mean, it's got physiological factors that it results in, what people don't realize, that you're depressed over a long period of time. It's going to lead to inflammatory related ailments, autoimmune disorders, cancer, and so on. And how is it that there's a country with all the technological advancement we have that we're getting lonelier every day? We don't have community. We're not able to share a lot more. Everybody's involved in their screens. And now for the next generation, you've got teenagers. I've got an 18-year-old and a 23-year-old, and I've seen how they've grown up with these devices. Every time that phone dings or blings, it's a dopamine trigger. And because you got to look at it. And so it's a dopamine response. Now, if you're growing up with these instruments, you're wired to be, looking out for these dopamine triggers, right, and dopamine responses. That's not healthy at all, because when you don't get that, when you don't get the like, the validation, the thumbs up, whatever, you get upset, you get angry, you get moody, and it starts to bother you, and that affects your mental health. So mental health is mental wealth. And there's going to be ups and downs here. I think that with the market coming back the way it is, private markets are looking at this very seriously. FDA has certainly shown over the last 5-6 years that many of these molecules and psychedelics are breakthrough designation, BTD status. Yeah. So all moving in the right direction, Maggie. And I think that this is a long game, but it's like being in oncology very early in the game. And there's no doubt that we're going to see cures for many of these ailments over the next 2 years. Absolutely no doubt.
One thing that strikes me when I hear you talk about it, and we were at an RV event, which is where we met, and there were others who were slightly different avenues, but along the same thing. I don't think anyone in finance is having as much fun or is as passionate as you all are.
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah. I don't see that as much. We're very passionate about it. And I'll tell you one of the biggest reasons. I have 2 daughters, aged 23 and 18. And between the two of them, at this point in their life, they've known 5 individuals in their ecosystem that have committed suicide. Now, how is that right in any way? I'm 51. I know one individual in my life that has committed suicide, a very dear friend.
We are experiencing a similar situation here. And we live in completely different places. But we had the same conversation. My children have known more people, either their peers or parents, that have committed. They've been to more funerals of people that have committed suicide than I have known in my life. It's extraordinary.
That's right. And that is not just specific to your family or my family. That is happening across the board, right? And that doesn't make any sense to me. And so the first thing we need to do is talk about mental health. The first thing we need to do is talk about how this is impacting everybody and what's really behind it. And then we need to start talking about all the ways in which we can actually cure this, not treat it. And believe me, SSRIs have been a huge disappointment, and all the big pharma companies know that. But now we're forcing their hand into looking down a pathway that, but by the way, they're very interested in now, right? Before they weren't.
Well, it's an epidemic.
It is.
And where there's an epidemic, there's an opportunity.
Yeah.
Saad, I'm so inspired by your passion every time we talk. Little did I know that there is an amazing life story behind it too. It has been so much fun. We went a little long, but it was worth it. It's been so amazing to catch up. You have a lot of wisdom to share.
Oh, no, you've been very kind, and it's always a pleasure. Thank you very much for the opportunity, Maggie. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
We hope you enjoyed the video. At Real Vision, we help you understand the complex world of finance, business, and the global economy with in-depth analysis from real experts. Join the revolution at realvision.com.